The Bahamas sunset looked beautiful behind my sister Seraphina as she raised her champagne flute on the luxury cruise deck. My $18,000 wedding fund had bought her quite the honeymoon with husband number 3. But when my 10-year-old nephew Caspian showed me the secret computer game Aunt Sera taught him, I finally understood how she'd stolen everything, and I knew exactly how to make her pay.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
Standing in the doorway of the Meridian Country Club's grand ballroom 6 months later, watching Seraphina address her guests at what she called her new beginning celebration, I gripped the tablet in my hands. The same tablet that would soon show everyone exactly what kind of person they were truly celebrating. But first, let me tell you how a woman I'd trusted with my life became the architect of my complete destruction. I should have known something was wrong when Seraphina moved back to town. After 2 failed marriages and a string of questionable business ventures that always seemed to collapse just before anyone could ask too many questions, my 38-year-old sister had perfected the art of reinvention. She arrived in Millbrook that September with designer luggage, a 10-year-old son who barely spoke above a whisper, and the kind of radiant smile that made everyone forget where her money actually came from. "Darling Evangeline," she'd said, embracing me outside my apartment with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't spent the last 5 years ignoring my calls and forgetting my birthday. "Look at you, all grown up and successful. I'm so proud of my baby sister." I was 29, hardly a baby, but something about Seraphina's presence always made me feel like I was still the awkward 12-year-old, desperately trying to keep up with her golden older sister. She had that effect on everyone. Even now, with silver threading through her auburn hair and laugh lines mapping the corners of her eyes, she commanded attention like a magnet pulling metal filings into perfect alignment. Caspian hung back during that first reunion, clutching a worn backpack and watching our interaction with the careful attention of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for survival. He had Seraphina's striking green eyes, but none of her confidence. All sharp angles and nervous energy wrapped in clothes that were expensive but somehow never quite fit right. "Say hello to your Aunt Evangeline, sweetheart," Seraphina prompted, her manicured hand gently pushing him forward. "The one I've told you so much about." The boy offered a quiet hello before retreating to his mother's shadow, and I felt an immediate kinship with his obvious discomfort. I remembered being that age at family gatherings, watching Seraphina effortlessly charm every adult in the room while I struggled to string together coherent sentences. She had that effect on everyone. Even now, with silver threading through her auburn hair and laugh lines mapping the corners of her eyes, she commanded attention like a magnet pulling metal filings into perfect alignment. Caspian hung back during that first reunion, clutching a worn backpack and watching our interaction with the careful attention of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for survival. He had Seraphina's striking green eyes, but none of her confidence. All sharp angles and nervous energy wrapped in clothes that were expensive but somehow never quite fit right. "Say hello to your Aunt Evangeline, sweetheart," Seraphina prompted, her manicured hand gently pushing him forward. "The one I've told you so much about." The boy offered a quiet hello before retreating to his mother's shadow, and I felt an immediate kinship with his obvious discomfort. I remembered being that age at family gatherings, watching Seraphina effortlessly charm every adult in the room while I struggled to string together coherent sentences. "He's shy," Seraphina explained with that musical laugh of hers. "The divorce was hard on him, and then Robert's passing so soon after. Well, it's been a difficult year, but we're starting fresh now, aren't we, darling?" She'd mentioned her second husband's death in passing during one of our rare phone calls, but seeing Caspian's hollow expression made the reality hit differently. This child had lost his father and been uprooted from everything familiar, all while his mother planned her next reinvention. Over the following weeks, Seraphina wove herself back into our family fabric with the skill of someone who'd been practicing social manipulation for decades. She rented a charming Victorian house on Elm Street, enrolled Caspian in Millbrook Elementary, and immediately began volunteering for every committee and charity event in town. Within a month, people were referring to her as such a breath of fresh air and exactly what this community needed. I watched it happen with a mixture of admiration and unease. Seraphina had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to make people feel special, chosen, important. She remembered names, asked follow-up questions about personal details, and somehow made every conversation feel like the most fascinating exchange of her day. Watching her work was like studying a masterclass in human psychology. But it was her relationship with Caspian that first made me truly uncomfortable. In public, she was the devoted mother, always touching his shoulder, praising his artistic abilities, speaking proudly about his sensitivity and intelligence. In private moments I accidentally witnessed, waiting in the car while she ran into a store or arriving early to pick them up, I caught glimpses of something colder. "Stop fidgeting, Caspian. People are watching," she'd hiss under her breath, her smile never wavering as she waved to neighbors. Or, "If you can't be charming, at least try not to be embarrassing." The boy would immediately straighten, his face going blank in a way that reminded me of someone switching off a television. He'd learned to disappear into himself, to become invisible when his mother needed him to be perfect. I started inviting Caspian over more frequently, ostensibly to help with homework, but really because something about his careful quietness broke my heart. He was brilliant, genuinely, startlingly intelligent, but he moved through the world like someone expecting to be criticized at any moment. During these visits, I began to understand why Seraphina had really come home to Millbrook. She was broke. Not just temporarily financially stressed, but completely, devastatingly broke. The expensive clothes were carefully maintained pieces from better days. The designer handbags were masterful knockoffs. Even the Victorian house rental was subsidized by a housing assistance program she'd somehow convinced the landlord to keep quiet about. But Seraphina had always been excellent at creating the illusion of prosperity, and Millbrook's social circles were hungry for someone exciting and sophisticated to adopt. Within 3 months, she was dating Hartford Blackwell, the recently widowed owner of Blackwell Industries, the largest manufacturing company in the county. Hartford was 62, kind-hearted, and desperately lonely after losing his wife of 35 years to cancer. He had 2 adult children who lived out of state and rarely visited, a sprawling estate that felt too empty, and more money than he knew what to do with. In other words, he was perfect for Seraphina's particular brand of salvation. I met Hartford at their engagement party in December, just 4 months after Seraphina had returned to town. He was a gentleman with silver hair and laugh lines around his eyes, someone who clearly believed he'd been blessed with unexpected love in his golden years. The way he looked at Seraphina, with wonder and gratitude and complete devotion, made my chest tight with protective worry. "She's remarkable, your sister," he told me that night, his voice warm with contentment. "I never thought I'd feel this way again. She's brought light back into my house." Seraphina glowed beside him, resplendent in a midnight blue dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She'd lost weight since moving to Millbrook, and her hair was professionally styled now, swept into an elegant chignon that made her look like she belonged in the pages of a society magazine. "Hartford spoils us terribly," she said, squeezing his arm affectionately. "Caspian's never had a father figure like him. Have you, sweetheart?" Caspian, dressed in a tiny tuxedo that made him look like a miniature adult, nodded obediently. But I caught the flash of something in his eyes. Confusion, maybe, or fear. He was still adjusting to this new version of his life, still trying to understand his role in his mother's latest performance. The wedding happened in February, a tasteful affair at the historic Millbrook Chapel with reception at the country club. Seraphina wore ivory silk and carried white roses, every inch the blushing bride, despite this being her 3rd walk down the aisle. Hartford's children flew in from California and Oregon, polite but clearly skeptical about their father's whirlwind romance. I stood up as Seraphina's maid of honor, wearing a dress she'd chosen for me, smiling for photos that would later make me sick to look at. Because by then, my own life had started falling apart in ways I couldn't understand. And watching my sister marry into wealth while I struggled to keep my head above water felt like salt in wounds I didn't even know I had.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The honeymoon cruise to the Bahamas cost $18,000. I know, because I'd seen the travel brochures Hartford had left scattered across his study, each one marking another expensive excursion or luxury experience he wanted to share with his new wife. 7 days and 6 nights aboard the Caribbean Princess, with a suite that had its own private balcony and 24-hour room service. What I didn't know then was that the money for that cruise, every single dollar, had come from the wedding fund I'd been building for 3 years. The fund I'd created after meeting Jonathan Pierce. The fund that represented not just my savings, but my dreams of finally having something beautiful and lasting of my own. But Seraphina had always been excellent at taking things that didn't belong to her, and she'd always been particularly talented at making me feel grateful to give them to her. The pattern started when we were children, long before I had words for what was happening to me. Our mother, Cordelia Ashworth, had always measured her worth through other people's achievements. When Dad left, Mom channeled all her frustrated ambitions into her daughters, but she didn't divide that attention equally. Seraphina was beautiful, charming, and precociously aware of how to use both qualities. I was bookish, awkward, and prone to asking inconvenient questions. In Mom's eyes, Seraphina was an investment with guaranteed returns. I was a project that might never pay off. I remember my 8th birthday party clearly because it was the last one I ever really enjoyed. Mom had rented the community center and invited my entire 2nd grade class. Then, Seraphina decided she was too mature for children's parties and announced she'd be at the mall with her high school friends instead. Mom spent the entire afternoon distracted, glancing toward the door expecting Seraphina to change her mind. When Seraphina returned that evening with gifts and stories about boys buying her smoothies, Mom treated her like she'd accomplished something remarkable. "You're so mature for your age," Mom told her. "Sometimes I forget you're only 14. This became our family's operating procedure. Seraphina's needs took precedence over everything else, including my basic requirement for parental attention. By high school, I'd learned to make myself invisible during family gatherings, becoming the family documentarian who took photos while staying carefully out of frame. Seraphina's first marriage to Marcus lasted 18 months before he was arrested for drug dealing. Her second marriage to Robert produced Caspian and lasted 8 years until Robert's sudden death from a heart attack. Each time, I watched her reinvent herself, using charm and manufactured vulnerability to attract new resources. When she returned to Millbrook with 10-year-old Caspian, I thought she was seeking family support during grief. I had no idea she was scouting her next target. Moving to Millbrook 3 years before Seraphina's arrival was the first decision I'd made entirely for myself. At Meridian Digital Solutions, I was simply Evangeline Ashworth. No one knew about my perfect older sister or my family's complicated dynamics. My supervisor, Patricia Chen, evaluated employees based on results rather than charm. She handed me 3 struggling accounts that previous coordinators had deemed impossible: a family restaurant, a mechanic shop, and a boutique florist. I turned around all 3 within 6 months. The restaurant's social media campaign increased repeat customers by 40%. The mechanic shop's old-school expertise, new-school technology campaign attracted younger clients. But it was the florist, Bella Flora, that really established my reputation. I convinced Maria Santos to offer design classes, turning her shop into a community gathering place. "You didn't just save my business," Maria told me. "You helped me remember why I became a florist in the first place." By my 2nd year, I was handling accounts worth over $500,000 annually. Patricia promoted me to senior coordinator, and clients specifically requested my services. "You don't just market businesses, you understand their souls," Patricia explained during my performance review. It was during a cooking class that I met Jonathan Pierce, a veterinarian who'd taken over his mentor's practice. He was quiet, thoughtful, and possessed gentle confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was. Our friendship developed naturally over shared cooking struggles and lengthy post-class conversations. You light up when you talk about your clients, he observed during our first official date. It's like you can see possibilities that other people miss. 6 months later, he proposed during a quiet Sunday morning in his kitchen while making coffee. The engagement ring was perfect, a simple solitaire chosen specifically for me by someone who understood that I valued thoughtfulness over ostentation. That's when I started the wedding fund. The wedding fund began as a simple savings account at Millbrook First National, started the week after Jonathan proposed. I opened it with $500 from my emergency fund and a promise to myself that I'd add $200 every month until we had enough for the wedding we both dreamed of. Jonathan and I had calculated the costs carefully during long evenings spent with bridal magazines and vendor price lists spread across my dining table. The chapel rental, reception venue, catering for 60 guests, flowers, photography, everything came to approximately $18,000. With careful saving and the modest contributions Jonathan insisted on making despite my protests, we'd have the full amount by the following summer. I kept the account details in a folder in my home office, along with our growing collection of wedding planning documents, guest lists, vendor contracts, menu tasting schedules, everything organized in the methodical way that had made me successful at Meridian Digital. Planning our wedding became my favorite evening activity, a tangible representation of the future Jonathan and I were building together. The first sign that something was wrong came in February, just days after Seraphina's wedding to Hartford. I'd received my monthly bank statement and was updating my wedding fund spreadsheet when I noticed an irregularity. Instead of the expected balance of $3,400, the account showed $2,800. $600 had simply vanished. I called the bank immediately, certain there'd been some kind of clerical error. The customer service representative, a young woman named Ashley, was polite but unhelpful. "I'm showing a withdrawal on February 15th for $600, she explained after reviewing my account. It was processed through our online banking system using your login credentials. "That's impossible," I said, pulling up my online banking app. "I haven't made any withdrawals from that account." "The transaction shows it was initiated from your registered IP address," Ashley continued. "Do you share your banking information with anyone, a spouse or family member?" I didn't. Jonathan and I maintained separate finances, and I'd never given anyone access to my banking credentials. But as I stared at the transaction details on my computer screen, a cold realization began forming in my stomach. February 15th was the day Seraphina had visited my apartment to borrow my laptop while hers was being repaired. She'd spent 3 hours at my dining table, supposedly working on thank you notes from her wedding, while I prepared dinner in the kitchen. My laptop had been open the entire time, automatically logged in to various accounts, including my banking portal. But suspecting and proving were different things entirely. When I confronted the bank about the unauthorized access, they insisted the transaction appeared legitimate from their security standpoint. Without proof that someone else had used my computer, they couldn't reverse the withdrawal. "I understand this is frustrating," Ashley said during my second call, "but the transaction was processed correctly according to our security protocols. If you believe this was fraudulent, you'll need to file a police report." Filing a police report against my sister felt impossible. What would I tell them? That Seraphina might have accessed my banking while I was making dinner? That she'd somehow memorized my passwords during the few hours she'd spent at my apartment? It sounded paranoid even to me. Instead, I changed all my passwords and decided to monitor the account more carefully. The $600 was a significant loss, but not devastating. I could make up the difference by increasing my monthly contributions or postponing some of the wedding extras we'd discussed. The second incident happened in April. This time, it was a withdrawal of $800, processed on the same day Seraphina had stopped by to drop off a wedding gift for Jonathan and I, a crystal vase that she claimed had been sitting unused in her new house. "Hartford has such generous taste, but honestly, we have more crystal than we know what to do with," she'd said, placing the gift on my kitchen counter. The vase was beautiful, probably worth several $100s, which made questioning her motives feel ungracious. But $800 had disappeared from my wedding fund that afternoon, withdrawn through the same online banking system during the hour Seraphina had spent in my apartment. This time, I was more direct with the bank. I explained that someone appeared to be accessing my accounts without permission, possibly during visits to my home. The fraud department opened an investigation, but the process would take weeks to complete. We'll need to review security footage from our ATM network and cross-reference the transaction times with your reported timeline, the investigator explained. In the meantime, I recommend switching to a new account with enhanced security features. I opened a new savings account that required two-factor authentication for all transactions, but the damage was already done. Nearly $1,500 of my wedding fund had vanished, and I was no closer to proving how or why. The professional problems began around the same time, though initially they seemed unrelated to my missing money. My computer at Meridian Digital started experiencing strange glitches, files that disappeared between sessions, emails that failed to send, presentations that corrupted moments before important client meetings. Technology can be so unreliable, Patricia observed after my third technical crisis in 2 weeks. Maybe it's time to request a new laptop from IT. But the new laptop didn't solve the problems. If anything, they got worse. Client communications went astray, project timelines became confused, and deliverables that I was certain I'd completed properly were somehow missing crucial elements when they reached their destinations. My reputation for reliability began suffering. Maria Santos from Bella Flora called to express confusion about why her monthly marketing report was 2 weeks late. Jim Peterson mentioned that his website updates hadn't been implemented despite our agreed-upon timeline. I don't understand what's happening, I confided to Jonathan during one of our evening dinners. It's like everything I touch turns to chaos. You've been under a lot of stress, he said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Planning a wedding, dealing with your sister's return, maintaining your workload, maybe you just need to slow down a little. His concern was genuine, but something in his tone suggested he thought the problems might be my fault, that I was overwhelmed, disorganized, or simply making careless mistakes under pressure. The implications stung, even though I couldn't blame him for drawing that conclusion. The truth was, I was beginning to doubt myself too. The woman who'd successfully managed multiple client accounts for 3 years was suddenly struggling with basic organizational tasks. Either I was having some kind of breakdown, or someone was deliberately sabotaging my work. Both possibilities terrified me, but for very different reasons. Despite the growing chaos in both my professional and financial life, wedding planning remained my anchor. Jonathan and I had chosen October 15th for the ceremony at Riverside Manor, with its Gothic Revival architecture creating the perfect blend of elegance and intimacy. By July, we had nearly $12,000 saved, enough to cover the major expenses with room for special touches. The photographer specialized in authentic moments rather than posed perfection. Maria Santos from Bella Flora had designed arrangements incorporating wildflowers from Jonathan's property. The menu featured locally sourced ingredients from a catering company that employed recent culinary school graduates. The wedding dress I'd chosen embodied our philosophy perfectly. At Miranda's boutique, I'd found a flowing A-line gown in champagne silk with delicate beadwork and 3/4 sleeves, elegant without being ostentatious, romantic without being frivolous. This design was inspired by 1940s Hollywood glamour, Miranda explained. It's sophisticated and classic, the kind of dress that makes the woman wearing it feel like the best version of herself. The price was $3,500. I wrote the check for $1,750 from our wedding fund, feeling a thrill of anticipation as I imagined walking down the aisle in something created specifically for me. The final dress fitting was scheduled for September 28th. Everything was falling into place. Guest list finalized, invitations sent, menu confirmed. Most importantly, our wedding fund had reached its target of $18,000. I was getting married in 17 days to a man who loved me completely, wearing a dress that made me feel beautiful. For the first time in my adult life, everything important was going exactly according to plan. The months leading up to our wedding were the happiest of my adult life. Jonathan and I had settled into a rhythm of genuine partnership that felt revolutionary after years of one-sided family dynamics. Our Sunday morning routine became sacred. fresh bagels from Goldstein's bakery, coffee he'd ground himself, and hours reading different sections of the newspaper aloud to each other, sharing articles and debating local politics over breakfast. This was how our relationship worked. Jonathan would identify opportunities to serve others, and I'd help him figure out how to make those opportunities financially viable. Together, we made each other more effective and more ambitious.
Our physical relationship had developed with the same thoughtful pace as our emotional connection. Jonathan was patient, attentive, and completely focused on my comfort and pleasure. "I love watching you think," he told me one evening. "Your face gets this concentrated expression, like you're solving puzzles that exist in a different dimension. It's the most attractive thing in the world." Our pre-marriage counseling with Reverend Thomas revealed how well-matched we were fundamentally. Where other couples struggled with communication or finances, we found ourselves nodding in agreement on most major issues. "You two have something special," Reverend Thomas observed. "You've figured out how to be individuals while building something together." Most importantly, Jonathan saw Seraphina's behavior clearly. "She treats you like you're less important than she is," he observed after a family dinner, "and you let her do it. Your family trained you to make yourself small so Seraphina could feel big," he said during one of our walks. "But you're extraordinary. Anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve access to your light." 2 weeks before our wedding, he surprised me with a leather-bound journal embossed with our wedding date. "For recording our adventures," he explained. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Caspian himself, who appeared at my apartment door looking uncomfortable in his school uniform. It was the first week of October, exactly 9 days before my wedding, and I was in full preparation mode, confirming final details with vendors, addressing thank you gifts for the wedding party, and managing the controlled chaos that accompanies any major celebration. "Mom wanted me to give this to you personally," Caspian said, holding out an elegant cream envelope with my name written in Seraphina's distinctive calligraphy. "Come in, sweetheart," I said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Would you like some juice? I think I have those apple juice boxes you like." Caspian nodded gratefully and followed me into the kitchen, his backpack sliding off one shoulder. He looked thinner than he had during the summer, and there were dark circles under his eyes that seemed too mature for a 10-year-old face. "How's school going?" I asked, retrieving the juice box from my refrigerator while he settled at my kitchen table. "It's okay," he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "The other kids think I talk weird because I lived in different places, and the math is different here than it was at my old school." I opened his juice box and handed it to him, noticing how he gripped it with both hands like it was precious. "Different how?" "They're doing multiplication tables, but my old teacher taught us division first, so I know harder stuff, but I don't know the easy stuff they think I should already know." The frustration in his voice was familiar. I remembered similar struggles when Mom moved us between school districts during her post-divorce financial instability, always feeling like I was simultaneously ahead and behind my new classmates. "That sounds really hard," I said, sitting across from him at the table. "Have you talked to your mom about it?" Caspian's expression shuddered immediately. "Mom's busy with Hartford stuff, wedding planning and house things and meeting all his important friends. She says I need to figure out how to adapt better." The casual cruelty of that statement, a 10-year-old being told to adapt better to circumstances entirely beyond his control, made my chest tight with protective anger. But I kept my voice neutral, knowing that Caspian didn't need another adult's emotional reaction to manage. "Well, you know you can always come here if you need help with homework," I offered. Math was actually one of my favorite subjects. His face brightened slightly. "Really? Mom says math is boring and only boys are naturally good at it." Another casual piece of damage, delivered with Seraphina's signature blend of limitation disguised as wisdom. I made a mental note to counter that particular piece of misinformation later. "Your mom is wrong about that," I said firmly. "Some of the best mathematicians and engineers I know are women, and math isn't boring. It's like solving puzzles that help you understand how the world works." Caspian considered this while sipping his juice. "Could you maybe help me catch up on the multiplication tables?
I practiced by myself, but I keep getting confused. Of course, I said, already mentally rearranging my wedding preparation schedule to accommodate tutoring sessions. That would be really good, he said, and for the first time since arriving, he smiled genuinely. It was only then that I remembered the envelope he'd delivered. I opened it to find an invitation printed on heavy cardstock announcing Seraphina and Hartford's 3-month anniversary celebration scheduled for the evening of October 14th. October 14th, the day before my wedding. The invitation was beautifully designed, featuring elegant typography and subtle gold accents. The event was described as an intimate gathering to celebrate new beginnings and lasting love, to be held at Hartford's estate beginning at 7 o'clock. Cocktails, dinner, and dancing were promised, along with special recognition of the family bonds that make love possible. I read the invitation twice, feeling a familiar knot forming in my stomach. A 3-month anniversary party was unusual enough, but scheduling it for the night before my wedding felt deliberately provocative. Seraphina had to know that I'd be finalizing last-minute wedding preparations, managing out-of-town guests, and trying to get adequate sleep before the most important day of my life. "This is for tomorrow night," I said to Caspian, who was finishing his juice box. "Yeah," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Mom's been planning it for weeks. She ordered special flowers and hired a band and everything. Hartford doesn't really understand why she wants such a big party, but he says whatever makes her happy makes him happy." The wistful tone in Caspian's voice when he mentioned Hartford suggested that his stepfather treated him with genuine kindness, which only made Seraphina's manipulation more disturbing. She was using this good man's love and generosity to fund her attention-seeking behaviors while undermining her own son's emotional security. "Are you excited about the party?" I asked, genuinely curious about how a 10-year-old processed this kind of adult drama. Caspian shrugged. "Mom says I have to be charming and make Hartford proud. She bought me a new suit and everything, but I don't really like parties where I don't know anyone." "That makes sense," I said. "Big social events can be overwhelming." "Will you come?" he asked suddenly, looking directly at me for the first time since delivering the invitation. "Mom said she especially wants you there because family is the most important thing." The obvious manipulation aside, there was something plaintive in Caspian's request that caught me off guard. He wanted me at this party not because of whatever scheme Seraphina was orchestrating, but because my presence would make him feel less alone among a crowd of strangers. "I'll try," I said, which was the most honest answer I could give. "But you know I'm getting married the next day, right? So I might not be able to stay very long." "I know," he said. "Mom mentioned that. She said it's really good timing because you'll already be in celebration mode." The comment was classic Seraphina, framing her transparent attention-grabbing as somehow beneficial to me. But looking at Caspian's hopeful expression, I realized that my decision about attending wouldn't just affect my pre-wedding preparations. It would also determine whether this lonely child had any allies at his mother's performance. "Tell your mom I'll be there," I said, making the decision that would later prove catastrophic. "But I'll need to leave early to finish my wedding preparations." Caspian's relief was immediate and visible. "Thank you, Aunt Evangeline. That really means a lot." After he left, I called Jonathan to discuss the invitation. He was between appointments at the clinic, but he listened patiently as I described the timing and my concerns about Seraphina's motivations. "It's definitely weird timing," he agreed. "But if you think it's important to be there for Caspian, we can make it work. I can handle the final venue walkthrough by myself if necessary." This was Jonathan at his most supportive, willing to adjust his own plans to accommodate my family obligations, even when those obligations seemed unreasonable. But something in his tone suggested he was less concerned about Seraphina's party than he was about my tendency to sacrifice my own needs for other people's comfort. "Just promise me you won't let her turn this into a bigger deal than our wedding," he said. "You've worked too hard planning our day to let anyone overshadow it." I promised, having no idea that Seraphina's party was designed to do exactly that, and that by attending, I'd be walking directly into a trap that would destroy everything I'd built with Jonathan. The RSVP card sat on my kitchen counter for hours before I finally filled it out and mailed it. One guest, would attend, dietary restrictions, none. Such a simple response to what would become the most devastating evening of my adult life. The week between accepting Seraphina's invitation and her anniversary party became a masterclass in systematic sabotage, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. It started with Maria Santos from Bella Flora calling Tuesday morning, her voice strained with confusion. I received a call from someone claiming to be your wedding coordinator, requesting significant changes to your floral order. The caller wanted to upgrade to imported roses and orchids, an additional $1,200. I'd never hired a wedding coordinator. After confirming I hadn't authorized changes, I immediately called Jonathan, who had his own strange story. Someone called the clinic claiming to represent Riverside Manor, he said. They said there had been a double booking error and asked if we could move our reception location. Wednesday brought a crisis with our photographer, Marcus Webb. He'd received an email from my Meridian digital address requesting that he substitute another photographer. When I checked my login history, it showed access from an IP address I didn't recognize. Thursday's attack was more sophisticated. The catering company called to confirm dietary restriction updates, extensive food allergies among our guests that would require completely redesigning the menu and increasing costs by $2,000. The documentation included names and detailed medical information that was completely fabricated. Someone has access to your personal information and is systematically contacting our vendors, Jonathan concluded after reviewing the timeline. They know details about our plans that only we should know. When I checked the security logs at Meridian Digital, they revealed the access had come from Hartford Blackwell's home internet service. Your sister, Jonathan said quietly. She's been in your apartment multiple times, and she knows all the vendor details. The systematic nature of the sabotage was undeniable, but accepting that my sister was orchestrating it required admitting that someone I'd trusted my entire life had become my enemy. The morning of October 14th dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that would have been ideal for an outdoor wedding rehearsal. Instead, I spent it dealing with a crisis that would shatter everything I'd built toward the next day's ceremony. The call came at 7:30 a.m. from Patricia Chen, her usually composed voice tight with barely controlled panic. Evangeline, I need you to come to the office immediately. There's been a serious problem with the client accounts, and your name is all over the financial discrepancies. I was still in my pajamas, planning to spend the morning on final wedding preparations before getting ready for Seraphina's anniversary party. The urgency in Patricia's voice sent ice water through my veins. What kind of discrepancies? I asked, already reaching for clothes. Money is missing from 3 client accounts, significant amounts. The preliminary investigation suggests the transfers were authorized using your login credentials. Evangeline, we're talking about nearly $40,000. The drive to Meridian Digital passed in a blur of mounting dread. $40,000 was more than my annual salary, more than the cost of 2 weddings, more than I could ever hope to repay if I was found responsible. By the time I arrived at the office, a small crowd had gathered in the conference room. Patricia, our office manager Karen Wong, and 2 people I didn't recognize wearing the kind of serious expressions that suggested law enforcement or corporate investigation. These are Detective Morrison from the Financial Crimes Unit and Sarah Kim from our corporate audit firm, Patricia explained as I took a seat at the conference table. They've been reviewing our client account security overnight. Detective Morrison was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every micro-expression. She slid a folder across the table toward me with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd conducted this type of interview hundreds of times. Miss Ashworth, we need to discuss some irregularities in your client account management. According to our preliminary investigation, 3 separate wire transfers were initiated from your computer terminal using your personal login credentials. I opened the folder to find printouts of banking records, computer logs, and authorization forms bearing my digital signature. The transfers had been made to accounts I'd never seen before, authorized at times when I'd been nowhere near the office. "I've never seen these accounts," I said, studying the bank routing numbers and recipient information. "And I was at home Tuesday evening when 2 of these transfers were supposedly made." "Can anyone verify your whereabouts?" asked Sarah Kim, the auditor. "My fiancé. We were having dinner and finalizing wedding details." Even as I said it, I realized how inadequate that sounded as an alibi for financial fraud. Detective Morrison made a note in her pad. "We'll need to speak with him as well. In the meantime, we need to understand how someone could have accessed your login credentials." The question I'd been dreading. Over the past week, I'd changed all my passwords and implemented enhanced security measures, but the damage had apparently already been done. Someone had been using my digital identity to steal money from clients who trusted me with their business's financial futures. "There have been some security issues with my personal accounts recently," I admitted. "Someone has been accessing my email and other systems without authorization." "Do you have any idea who might have gained access?" Patricia asked, her expression a mixture of concern and professional disappointment. The answer was obvious, but saying it out loud would sound like deflection from someone caught embezzling. How could I explain that my sister had been systematically sabotaging my life without sounding paranoid or delusional? "I believe it might be a family member," I said, carefully, "someone who has had access to my home computer and personal information." Detective Morrison's eyebrows raised slightly. "You're suggesting a family member stole $40,000 from your clients?" "I'm suggesting someone with intimate access to my personal life has been interfering with my work and personal accounts for several weeks." The next 3 hours were a nightmare of questions, accusations, and mounting evidence that painted me as either a criminal or catastrophically careless with security protocols. The auditor walked me through each fraudulent transaction, showing how they'd been processed through legitimate channels, using authentic credentials at times when I supposedly had authorized access. "The problem, Miss Ashworth, is that these transactions show a pattern of behavior consistent with someone gradually stealing money from client accounts," Sarah Kim explained. "Small amounts initially, then larger sums as confidence grew." "But I didn't steal anything," I insisted, hearing the desperation in my own voice. "Someone is using my identity to commit these crimes." "Then we need to figure out how they gained access and why they chose to frame you specifically," Detective Morrison said. "This level of digital identity theft requires significant technical knowledge and intimate familiarity with your personal and professional routines." By noon, the investigation had reached a temporary conclusion that felt like a death sentence. I was suspended from Meridian Digital pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. My computer access was revoked, my office cleared out, and my client relationships transferred to other account managers. "I'm sorry, Evangeline," Patricia said as she walked me to the parking garage. "I want to believe this isn't what it looks like, but the evidence is overwhelming. Until we can prove someone else was responsible, the company has to protect itself and our clients." The drive home felt like traveling through a tunnel where all sound was muffled and all color had been drained from the world. My wedding was tomorrow, but I was now unemployed and under investigation for embezzlement. Jonathan and I had spent our savings on wedding expenses, leaving us with no financial cushion to weather this crisis. I called Jonathan from my apartment, my voice breaking as I tried to explain what had happened. "They think I stole $40,000 from clients," I said through tears. "Jonathan, I could go to prison." "We'll figure this out," he said immediately. "I'm leaving the clinic now. Don't talk to anyone else until I get there." But there was one call I had to make first. I dialed Seraphina's number with shaking fingers, desperate for family support, even though my suspicions about her involvement had only grown stronger. "Evangeline," she answered brightly, "I was just thinking about you. Are you excited about tonight's party? And tomorrow's big day, of course." Sera, I need to ask you something directly, I said, abandoning any pretense of small talk. Have you been accessing my computer accounts? The pause that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt eternal. What a strange question, she finally said, her voice carrying a note of wounded innocence. Why would you think I'd do something like that? Because someone has been sabotaging my work and personal life, and they have information only someone close to me could access. Evangeline, you sound paranoid. Has the wedding stress been getting to you? Maybe you should consider postponing if you're having some kind of breakdown. The casual cruelty of suggesting I postpone my wedding while framing my justified suspicions as mental instability was so perfectly Seraphina that it confirmed everything Jonathan and I had theorized. I'm not having a breakdown, I said. Someone stole $40,000 from my clients using my computer access, and I think it was you. That's a very serious accusation, Seraphina said, her tone shifting to something colder. Are you sure you want to accuse your own sister of a felony the day before your wedding? The implicit threat was clear: back down or face consequences that would extend beyond professional ruin. I just need to know the truth, I said. The truth is that you're under tremendous stress and looking for someone to blame for your own mistakes, she replied. But I love you anyway, and I hope you'll still come to the party tonight. Family support is what you need right now, not wild accusations. After she hung up, I sat in my empty apartment staring at the wedding dress hanging in my closet, understanding that my sister had orchestrated the perfect crime. She'd stolen my money, destroyed my career, and positioned herself as the concerned family member trying to help me through my self-created crisis. When Jonathan arrived an hour later, he found me still sitting on my couch, staring at nothing. "We're going to fight this," he said, pulling me into his arms. "We're going to prove your innocence and make sure whoever did this pays for it." "The wedding," I whispered against his chest. "All our money is gone. My job is gone. How can we have a wedding?" "We'll figure it out," he said firmly, "one crisis at a time." But even as he held me and promised that everything would work out, I could feel something fundamental shifting between us. The woman he'd agreed to marry had been successful, stable, and financially responsible. Now I was unemployed, under criminal investigation, and potentially facing prison time. Our wedding was 16 hours away, and I had no idea if we'd still be together by the time the sun set tomorrow. The conversation that would ultimately end my relationship with Jonathan began at 4 o'clock that afternoon, just 3 hours before Seraphina's anniversary party. He'd spent the day making phone calls on my behalf, contacting lawyers, researching financial fraud defense strategies, and trying to reschedule vendor payments for our wedding. "We need to talk about tomorrow," he said, settling beside me on my couch with the careful distance that had become characteristic of our interactions since the morning's revelation. I'd been dreading this conversation since Detective Morrison had first mentioned potential prison time. Jonathan was a respected veterinarian with a practice to protect and a reputation in the community that couldn't afford association with financial criminals. Marrying someone under investigation for embezzlement would damage everything he'd worked to build. "I understand if you want to postpone," I said, trying to make it easier for him to voice what I knew he was thinking. "It's not about postponing," he said quietly. "It's about whether we can move forward at all until this is resolved." The words hit me like physical blows, even though I'd been expecting them. Jonathan was a practical man who made decisions based on evidence and logic. The evidence suggested that his fiancée was either a criminal or catastrophically irresponsible with digital security. Either way, I'd become a liability to his carefully ordered life. "The lawyer I spoke with says financial fraud cases can take months or even years to resolve," he continued, his voice steady but distant. "Even if you're completely innocent, the investigation will dominate our lives. Your career is destroyed, our savings are gone, and we're looking at massive legal bills just to prove you didn't commit crimes." "So you want to call off the engagement?" I said, making the statement that he seemed unable to voice directly. "I want to understand how this happened," he replied. 3 months ago, you were the most organized, competent person I knew. Now you're telling me that someone, your own sister, has been systematically destroying your life and you never noticed until it was too late? The accusation beneath his questions was clear. Either I was lying about my innocence, or I was too naive and careless to protect myself from obvious manipulation. Neither option suggested the kind of partner he wanted for a lifetime commitment. You think I'm responsible for this? I said, the reality settling over me like a funeral shroud. I think something doesn't add up, he said carefully. The evangelical I fell in love with would never have let someone gain that level of access to her personal and professional accounts. She would have recognized the signs of sabotage weeks ago and taken steps to protect herself. His words stung because they contained an element of truth that I couldn't dispute. I had noticed irregularities, had suspected interference, but I'd consistently chosen family loyalty over self-protection. Every time evidence pointed toward Seraphina, I'd looked for alternative explanations rather than confronting the obvious truth. Maybe the woman you fell in love with was an illusion, I said, hearing the bitterness in my own voice. Maybe I'm exactly as weak and foolish as my family always said I was. Don't do that, Jonathan said, his tone sharpening. Don't turn this into some self-pity narrative about family dynamics. This is about $40,000 of other people's money and the choices you made that let it happen. The clinical way he framed the situation, reducing years of psychological manipulation to choices I made, revealed how fundamentally he'd misunderstood both me and our relationship. He'd seen my competence and kindness as natural traits, rather than carefully developed armor against a lifetime of systematic undermining. You want someone stronger, I said, understanding finally penetrating the fog of crisis and heartbreak. Someone who wouldn't have let this happen. I want someone who takes responsibility for their actions instead of blaming family members for their professional failures. The accusation was so unfair, so completely divorced from the reality of what I'd experienced, that it crystallized everything I'd been too heartbreaking to acknowledge. Jonathan had never truly understood the dynamics that shaped me. He'd fallen in love with the successful, confident woman I'd become in spite of my family, but he couldn't comprehend the vulnerability that family dysfunction had created in me. Then you should find her, I said, pulling my engagement ring off my finger with hands that shook only slightly. Because I'm not strong enough for what we're facing. He stared at the ring I'd placed on the coffee table between us, his expression unreadable. Evangeline, I didn't say. You didn't have to say it, I interrupted. You've been pulling away from me since this morning. You're already thinking about how to protect yourself from the damage I'll cause to your reputation. That's not fair. Fair? The word came out as a laugh that contained no humor. Nothing about this situation is fair. But you're right that I made choices. I chose to trust my sister despite evidence that she was sabotaging me. I chose to prioritize family loyalty over self-protection. I chose to believe that someone I loved wouldn't deliberately destroy my life. Jonathan ran his hands through his hair, the gesture I'd once found endearing that now just looked frustrated and exhausted. Where does that leave us? He asked. It leaves you free to find someone who won't bring criminal investigations and family drama into your peaceful life, I said, standing up from the couch. It leaves me alone to figure out how to rebuild everything I've lost. I never said I wanted to be free of you. But you do, I said with certainty that surprised both of us. You want the woman you thought you were marrying, not the woman who's actually sitting in this room. And honestly, I don't blame you. The silence that followed stretched between us like a chasm that couldn't be crossed. We'd spent months planning a future together, but that future had been based on assumptions about who we were and what we could handle. The crisis had revealed that Jonathan needed a partner who would never require him to choose between love and security, while I needed someone who would stand with me through chaos and uncertainty. I should go, he said finally, making no move to retrieve the engagement ring from the coffee table between us. Yes, I agreed, you should. After he left, I sat in my empty apartment, surrounded by wedding preparations for a ceremony that wouldn't happen. The dress hanging in my closet, the favors stacked on my dining table, the final timeline I'd printed that morning. All of it now meaningless debris from a life that had imploded in the span of 12 hours. At 6:30, I received a text message from Seraphina. "Looking forward to seeing you tonight. We're something festive. We're celebrating new beginnings." The casual cruelty of the timing, sending celebration invitations while my life collapsed, confirmed what I'd known all along. My sister hadn't just stolen money and destroyed my career. She'd orchestrated the perfect psychological campaign designed to isolate me from everyone who might support me through the aftermath. I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, seeing a woman I barely recognized. The competent marketing professional was gone, the happy bride-to-be had vanished. What remained was someone who's lost everything: job, fiancé, savings, reputation, in a single day. But something else was emerging from the wreckage. Something harder and more dangerous than the accommodating sister who'd spent decades absorbing Seraphina's cruelty in silence. I was going to her anniversary party tonight, not as the grateful younger sister thankful for inclusion, but as someone with absolutely nothing left to lose. And people with nothing left to lose, I was beginning to understand, were capable of things that their former selves would never have imagined. The woman who walked into that party would be different from the one who'd woken up this morning planning her wedding. Seraphina had succeeded in destroying the life I'd built, but in the process, she'd created someone far more dangerous than she'd anticipated. Someone who finally understood that the only way to stop a predator was to become a hunter. I arrived at Hartford's estate at 7:15, deliberately late enough to make an entrance, but not so late as to appear disrespectful. The circular driveway was lined with luxury vehicles: BMWs, Mercedes, a few Teslas, the kind of automotive display that Hartford's social circle considered understated elegance. The house itself was a monument to old money restraint, Georgian colonial architecture with perfectly manicured grounds and subtle lighting that made everything look like a magazine spread. Through the tall windows, I could see guests mingling in what appeared to be the formal living room, their laughter and conversation creating a soundtrack of sophisticated celebration. I'd chosen my outfit carefully: a navy dress that was elegant without being attention-seeking, jewelry that suggested success without ostentation. The goal was to blend into the background while observing, to play the role of the grateful younger sister attending her siblings' happiness while gathering intelligence about my enemy. Seraphina greeted me at the front door wearing a stunning emerald dress that perfectly complemented her auburn hair and made her skin glow like porcelain. She looked every inch the successful wife of a wealthy man, confident and radiant in ways that seemed to come naturally. "Evangeline," she exclaimed, embracing me with what appeared to be genuine warmth, "I'm so glad you came. I know tomorrow is your big day, but family celebrations are important too." The casual reference to my wedding, delivered with perfect sisterly enthusiasm, was masterful. To any observer, she appeared supportive and inclusive. Only I could hear the subtle mockery beneath her words, the knowledge that there would be no wedding tomorrow. "Thank you for including me," I replied, matching her tone of familial affection. "The house looks beautiful." "Hartford spares no expense when it comes to making me happy," she said, linking her arm from mine as she led me into the living room. "He says I deserve to be celebrated properly." The party was exactly what I expected. 50 or so guests representing Millbrook's social and business elite, everyone dressed expensively and talking in the kind of code that established wealth and status without appearing vulgar. Hartford moved through the crowd like a benevolent host, clearly delighted by his wife's happiness and the obvious success of her social integration. Caspian appeared at my elbow within minutes of my arrival, looking uncomfortable in a navy suit that was perfectly tailored but somehow made him seem even younger than his 10 years. "Aunt Evangeline," he said quietly, "can I show you something upstairs? Mom said I could give you a tour of the house." I glanced around the room, noting that Seraphina was deep in conversation with a group of women who were hanging on her every word. Hartford was discussing business with several men near the fireplace. No one was paying attention to Caspian or me. Of course, I said, grateful for an excuse to escape the performative celebration. Lead the way. Caspian guided me up a curved staircase to the second floor, past oil paintings of Hartford's ancestors, and toward what appeared to be a home office. The hallway was lined with family photos, Hartford's children and grandchildren, wedding photos from his first marriage, and recent pictures of him with Seraphina and Caspian that suggested genuine family happiness. "This is Hartford's study," Caspian said, opening the door to reveal a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive mahogany desk. The room felt masculine and comfortable, with leather furniture and the kind of organized clutter that suggested actual work rather than decorative staging. But it was the computer setup that caught my attention. Multiple monitors, professional-grade equipment, and a setup that looked far more sophisticated than what most people needed for basic home use. "Hartford used to be in technology before he inherited the manufacturing business," Caspian explained, noticing my interest. "He still likes having the latest equipment." I moved closer to the desk, noting the various cables and devices that suggested someone who took digital security seriously. But what made my pulse quicken was the small notebook lying open beside the keyboard, a notebook filled with what appeared to be passwords and account information written in Seraphina's distinctive handwriting. "Caspian," I said carefully, "does your mom use Hartford's computer often?" "All the time," he replied, settling into one of the leather chairs. "She says her laptop is too slow for the important stuff she needs to do. Hartford doesn't mind. He says what's his is hers, now that they're married." The innocent explanation felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place. Seraphina had unlimited access to Hartford's sophisticated computer setup, complete with the kind of security features and processing power that would make financial fraud much easier to execute and harder to trace. "What kind of important stuff?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Caspian shrugged. "I don't really understand it. She spends hours up here sometimes, working on what she calls family business. She's been doing it since we moved here, especially at night after Hartford goes to bed." Family business. The euphemism was so perfectly Seraphina, framing criminal activity as some kind of domestic responsibility. "Does she ever ask you to help with anything?" I asked. "Sometimes she has me write down numbers or remember passwords while she's working. She calls it our secret game and says Hartford doesn't need to know about all the boring details of managing household accounts." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Seraphina had been using her own 10-year-old son as an accomplice in financial fraud, manipulating his natural desire to help his mother into participation in criminal activity. The psychological damage she was inflicting on this child went beyond anything I'd imagined. "Caspian," I said, sitting down so we were at eye level, "what kind of numbers does your mom have you write down?" "Banking numbers, mostly," he said, his expression growing uncertain as he registered the serious tone in my voice. "And sometimes she has me help her remember login information for different websites. She says she has trouble keeping track of all the accounts she needs to manage." My throat felt tight as the full scope of Seraphina's operation became clear. She wasn't just stealing from my clients. She was running a comprehensive financial fraud scheme, using Hartford's computer equipment and her own son as an unwitting assistant. "Has she ever mentioned my name during these sessions?" I asked. Caspian's face flushed slightly. "She said you were having some trouble at work and that she was trying to help you fix some problems with your accounts. She made me promise not to tell anyone because you'd be embarrassed if people knew you needed help." The masterful manipulation was breathtaking. Seraphina had convinced her son that he was helping her aunt through a difficult time, turning him into an accessory to the very crimes that were destroying my life. "Caspian," I said gently, "I need to ask you to do something very important. Can you show me exactly what your mom has you write down during these sessions?" He looked conflicted, clearly torn between loyalty to his mother and the growing awareness that something wasn't right about their secret game. "She said I should never tell anyone," he said quietly. "I understand, and I know you want to protect your mom," I replied. "But sometimes protecting someone means getting help when they're doing things that might hurt other people." For a long moment, Caspian stared at his hands, wrestling with a moral complexity that no 10-year-old should have to navigate. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I think she might be doing something bad, but I don't know how to stop her without getting her in trouble." The anguish in his voice broke my heart. This child had been living with the knowledge that his mother was engaged in questionable activities, carrying the burden of protecting her while suspecting that protection might come at the cost of other people's welfare. "You're not responsible for your mom's choices," I told him firmly, "and getting help for someone who's making bad decisions isn't the same as getting them in trouble. It's trying to help them stop before things get worse." Caspian nodded slowly, then walked to a bookshelf and retrieved a small notebook from between two volumes of what appeared to be Hartford's business references. The notebook was filled with pages of numbers, account information, and login credentials, all written in Caspian's careful 10-year-old handwriting. "She has me write this stuff down because she says computers aren't secure," he explained, handing me the notebook, "but I'm supposed to burn the pages after she uses them." As I flipped through the notebook, I found detailed records of financial transactions, account numbers that I recognized from my own banking information, and notes about timing and security protocols that revealed the sophisticated nature of Seraphina's operation. But it was the final entries that made my hands shake as I read them. Lists of vendor information from my wedding, contact details for Jonathan's veterinary practice, and what appeared to be a timeline for relationship disruption activities scheduled for the week leading up to my wedding. Seraphina hadn't just stolen money from my clients, she'd planned the complete destruction of my personal and professional life with the methodical precision of a military campaign, using her own son as a record keeper for her psychological warfare. "Caspian," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest, "would you be willing to help me make sure your mom gets the help she needs?" He nodded without hesitation. "Yes, I don't want her to hurt anyone else." For the first time in weeks, I felt something that resembled hope. I finally had proof of Seraphina's crimes, and more importantly, I had a witness who could corroborate how she'd been conducting her financial fraud operation. The hunt was about to begin. The 20 minutes Caspian and I spent in Hartford's study transformed me from a victim seeking answers into a detective building a case. While party music drifted up from the first floor and guests celebrated Seraphina's performance of marital bliss, I photographed every page of Caspian's notebook with my phone, creating a digital record of his mother's criminal enterprise. "Can you explain what this timeline means?" I asked, showing him a page that detailed e-disruption schedule with dates corresponding to the vendor sabotage attempts. Caspian studied the page with the serious concentration of a child who'd been forced to mature beyond his years. "Mom had me write down when different things needed to happen. She said timing was important for helping you, but she never told me what the things actually meant." The timeline was devastating in its precision. Every mysterious vendor call, every computer glitch, every financial irregularity had been scheduled weeks in advance. Seraphina had orchestrated my professional destruction with the methodical planning of a corporate project manager. "What about these account numbers?" I asked, pointing to a series of banking details that I didn't recognize. "Those are the accounts where Mom moves money before it goes to the final places," Caspian explained matter-of-factly. "She said it's like a filing system. You have to organize things properly before you put them where they really belong." Even a 10-year-old could understand that his mother was laundering money through multiple accounts to obscure the trail of her thefts. The sophistication of the operation was staggering, but so was the casual way Seraphina had involved her son in every aspect of her criminal activity. "Caspian, do you know where your mom keeps the computer files related to this work?" He nodded, moving to Hartford's desk and pointing to an encrypted external drive plugged into one of the USB ports. "She always uses that drive for her important files. She says the computer's hard drive isn't secure enough for sensitive information." I stared at the small device that likely contained comprehensive evidence of Seraphina's crimes. Getting access to it would require technical knowledge I didn't possess, but the fact that it existed meant there was digital proof beyond just Caspian's handwritten records. Has she ever talked about what would happen if someone found out about these activities? I asked. She said if anyone ever asked questions, I should tell them I was just playing games and didn't understand what the numbers meant, Caspian replied. She said sometimes adults have to do complicated things that kids can't understand, and that it's better for everyone if I just kept our work private. The manipulation was breathtaking. Seraphina had groomed her own son to be both accomplice and cover story, training him to deflect investigation while genuinely believing he was protecting his mother from embarrassment rather than criminal prosecution. A soft knock on the study door interrupted our conversation. "Caspian, are you up here?" Seraphina's voice carried a note of maternal concern that would have sounded perfectly normal to anyone who didn't know what we'd been discussing. "Yes, Mom," Caspian called back, his voice immediately shifting to the careful politeness I'd noticed whenever he interacted with his mother in public. "I was showing Aunt Evangeline Hartford's books." "That's wonderful, sweetheart, but we should rejoin the party. Hartford wants to make a toast, and I'd like my family there to share the moment." I quickly pocketed my phone containing the photographs of Caspian's notebook while he returned the original to its hiding place between the business volumes. When Seraphina entered the study, her expression was perfectly composed, showing no sign that she suspected anything unusual. "There you are," she said, smiling warmly at both of us. "I hope Caspian hasn't been boring you with technical explanations. He gets so excited about computers and numbers." "He's been very educational," I replied, meaning it in ways she couldn't imagine. "You've raised a remarkably intelligent son." "Thank you," she said, her hand settling possessively on Caspian's shoulder. "He's my greatest achievement. Aren't you, darling?" Caspian nodded dutifully, but I caught the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. He was beginning to understand that his mother's praise was conditional on his continued cooperation with activities that made him increasingly uncomfortable. We returned to the party, where Hartford was indeed preparing to make a toast. The guests had gathered in the living room, champagne glasses raised, faces bright with anticipation of celebratory words. Seraphina positioned herself beside her husband with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent her entire adult life being the focal point of other people's admiration. "3 months ago," Hartford began, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine happiness, "I thought my capacity for love had been permanently diminished by loss. Then Seraphina and Caspian came into my life, and I discovered that the heart doesn't have limits, it just needs the right people to help it expand." The guests murmured appreciatively, many dabbing at their eyes with cocktail napkins. Hartford's obvious devotion to his new family was genuinely touching, which made Seraphina's exploitation of his feelings even more despicable. "To my beautiful wife," Hartford continued, raising his glass toward Seraphina, "who has given me reasons to wake up excited about the future again. And to Caspian, who has made me remember what it means to be a father." The toast was met with enthusiastic applause and calls of "hear, hear" from the assembled guests. Seraphina accepted the adoration with her characteristic grace, kissing Hartford's cheek and managing to look both humble and radiant simultaneously. But as I watched this performance of familial happiness, I was calculating the evidence I'd gathered and planning my next moves. Caspian's notebook provided detailed records of financial transactions. The external drive contained digital files that could corroborate the handwritten evidence. Most importantly, I now had a witness who could explain exactly how Seraphina had been conducting her criminal operations. The challenge would be extracting Caspian from his mother's influence long enough to speak with law enforcement safely. Seraphina had spent months grooming him to protect her secrets, and breaking that psychological conditioning would require careful handling by people trained in child victim advocacy. As the party continued around me, I excused myself to the bathroom and used the privacy to call Detective Morrison's direct number. She answered on the second ring, despite the late evening hour. "Detective, this is Evangeline Ashworth. I believe I have significant evidence related to the financial fraud investigation, including the identity of the actual perpetrator." "Miss Ashworth, given your status in this investigation, I need to advise you that anything you say could—" The perpetrator is my sister, Seraphina Blackwell, and she's been using her 10-year-old son as an accomplice, I interrupted. I have photographic evidence of handwritten records detailing the crimes, and the child is prepared to testify about his mother's activities. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Where are you currently, Miss Ashworth? I'm at the perpetrator's anniversary party where she's celebrating her marriage while her son is upstairs carrying the psychological burden of her criminal activities. Stay exactly where you are, Detective Morrison said immediately. I'm contacting Child Protective Services and arranging for backup. Do not confront your sister and do not leave the premises until we arrive.
Understood, I replied, feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation that the nightmare was finally approaching its conclusion. When I returned to the party, Seraphina was holding court near the fireplace, regaling a group of women with what appeared to be amusing anecdotes about married life. Her laughter rang out like silver bells, creating the perfect soundtrack for her own downfall. I positioned myself where I could observe both Seraphina and Caspian, prepared to intervene if she showed any sign of suspecting that her secrets had been exposed. The boy was sitting quietly in a corner chair, looking exhausted by the evening's social demands and the weight of knowledge he'd been carrying for months. In less than an hour, law enforcement would arrive to arrest his mother and begin the process of protecting him from further psychological damage. The evidence was gathered, the witness was secured, and justice was finally within reach. Seraphina had orchestrated the perfect crime, but she'd made one crucial miscalculation. She'd underestimated the intelligence and moral compass of her own son, the child she tried to use as a weapon against me, but who had ultimately become the key to her downfall. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The 30-minute wait for law enforcement felt like an eternity of carefully controlled tension. I positioned myself near the refreshment table, where I could observe both Seraphina's social performance and Caspian's increasing exhaustion, while appearing to be nothing more than a single woman enjoying her sister's anniversary celebration. Detective Morrison had been clear about maintaining the status quo until backup arrived, but every moment of delay felt like an opportunity for Seraphina to sense danger and potentially harm Caspian or destroy evidence. I watched her work the room with practiced precision, ensuring that every guest felt personally attended to while maintaining the gracious hostess persona that had made her so successful in Millbrook's social circles. At 8:45, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Detective Morrison, we're positioned outside. Child Services Specialist Dr. Sera Chen is with us. Need you to create opportunity for private conversation with the child before we proceed. The request was both reasonable and terrifying. Extracting Caspian from the party without alerting Seraphina would require the kind of social manipulation that my sister had perfected but I'd never mastered. However, I'd spent the evening studying her techniques, and desperation had sharpened my observational skills considerably. I approached Hartford, who was standing near the piano discussing business with several other men. His face lit up when he saw me approaching, the kind of genuine warmth that suggested he truly valued his connection to Seraphina's family. Evangeline, he said, excusing himself from the business conversation. Are you enjoying the party? I know Seraphina was so pleased that you could be here, despite your wedding preparations tomorrow. The casual reference to my wedding, which would never happen, created a surreal moment of cognitive dissonance. Hartford genuinely believed he was hosting a celebration that honored family bonds, while in reality, he was providing the venue for the exposure of his wife's criminal enterprise. It's been lovely, I replied, then lowered my voice conspiratorially. I was wondering if I could ask a small favor. Caspian mentioned he's been struggling with some math concepts at school, and I promised I'd help him with a particularly challenging problem. Would it be all right if I borrowed him for 15 minutes to go over it privately? Hartford's expression immediately shifted to concerned stepfather mode. Of course, education is so important, and Caspian is such a bright boy. He's been having some adjustment difficulties with the move, but having family support makes all the difference. The irony was devastating.
Hartford wanted to support Caspian's academic development, unaware that his wife had been using the boy's intelligence to facilitate financial crimes that could result in his removal from their home entirely. "Where would be the best place for us to work?" I asked. "The library would be perfect," Hartford suggested. "It's quiet and there are plenty of reference materials if you need them, just down the hall from my study." Within minutes, I'd extracted Caspian from the party using the cover story of academic tutoring. He followed me to the library without question, though his expression suggested he understood that something significant was happening beyond homework assistance.
The library was a beautiful room, lined with first-edition books and comfortable reading chairs, the kind of space that suggested genuine intellectual engagement rather than decorative staging. I closed the door behind us and immediately went to the window, where I could see unmarked vehicles positioned discreetly along the street. "Caspian," I said, keeping my voice low and calm, "I need to tell you something important. The police are here to talk to your mother about the things she's been doing on Hartford's computer." His face went pale, but he didn't look surprised. "Are they going to arrest her?" "I think so," I said honestly. "But there are also people here whose job is to make sure you're safe and protected during this process." "What's going to happen to me?" he asked, his 10-year-old voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been forced to consider adult consequences for months. "There's a woman named Dr. Chen who specializes in helping children who've been in situations like yours. She's going to talk to you about what you've experienced and make sure you have support while the grown-ups figure out the legal issues." Caspian sat down heavily in one of the reading chairs, his small frame almost disappearing into the leather upholstery. I knew this would happen eventually. Mom's been getting more and more worried about someone finding out. She's been making more mistakes and asking me to help with scarier stuff. "What kind of scarier stuff?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "She wanted me to learn how to delete computer files permanently," he said quietly, "and she's been talking about maybe needing to move again soon, just her and me, if things got complicated with Hartford." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Seraphina had been preparing an exit strategy that would have involved destroying evidence and disappearing with Caspian, leaving Hartford to deal with the legal and financial consequences of crimes he knew nothing about. "Caspian, you've been incredibly brave through all of this," I told him. "What your mom asked you to do wasn't your fault, and you're not in trouble for any of it." "But I helped her hurt you," he said, tears finally spilling over. "I wrote down the numbers and passwords that let her steal your money and ruin your wedding. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to stop her without making her angry." The anguish in his voice broke my heart. This child had been carrying the moral weight of his mother's crimes while simultaneously being manipulated into believing he was protecting her. The psychological damage would require years of therapy to address. "You were trying to take care of your mom because you love her," I said, kneeling beside his chair. "That's not wrong. That's what children are supposed to do. The wrong thing was her asking you to carry responsibilities that should never be given to a child." A soft knock on the library door interrupted our conversation. "Ms. Ashworth?" A woman's voice, professional but warm. "This is Dr. Chen. May I come in?" I opened the door to find an Asian woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the kind of presence that suggested extensive experience with traumatized children. She was accompanied by Detective Morrison and 2 uniformed officers I didn't recognize. "Hello, Caspian," Dr. Chen said. "I'm Dr. Chen, and I work with children who've been in complicated situations with their families. Would it be all right if we talked privately for a few minutes?" Caspian looked at me questioningly, and I nodded encouragingly. "Dr. Chen is here to help," I assured him. "You can tell her anything, and she'll make sure you're safe." As Dr. Chen settled into a chair across from Caspian and began what was clearly a practiced routine for interviewing child witnesses, Detective Morrison pulled me aside. "We need to coordinate the arrest timing carefully," she explained in a low voice. "Once we take your sister into custody, this party becomes a crime scene. We'd prefer to minimize the social disruption, but we also can't allow her any opportunity to destroy evidence or influence the child." "She's been preparing an exit strategy," I informed her. "Caspian says she's been talking about disappearing with him if things got complicated." Detective Morrison's expression hardened. "Then we move now.
Can you create a distraction that will get her away from the main group of guests? I considered the layout of the house and Seraphina's behavioral patterns. She was deeply invested in maintaining her hostess performance, but there was one thing that would cause her to abandon her guests immediately. "Tell me when you're ready," I said. "I'll make her think something's wrong with Caspian. She'll come running, if only to control the narrative." 10 minutes later, Dr. Chen emerged from her conversation with Caspian looking both satisfied and deeply concerned. "He's been incredibly helpful," she reported, "and he's agreed to stay with me during the arrest process. The boy has remarkable resilience, but he'll need extensive support moving forward." Detective Morrison checked her radio and nodded to the uniformed officers. "Let's proceed. Miss Ashworth, please return to the party and execute your distraction plan. We'll be in position within 2 minutes." As I walked back toward the sound of celebration, I felt a strange combination of anticipation and sorrow. Seraphina had destroyed my career, my relationship, and my financial security, but she was still my sister. Watching her arrest would provide justice, but it wouldn't restore everything I'd lost. The woman who'd spent months orchestrating my downfall was about to discover that her own son had become the architect of her destruction. In trying to use Caspian as a weapon against me, she'd created the witness who would ultimately ensure her conviction. Justice was finally within reach, but it would come at a cost that would forever change our family's landscape. The morning of October 14th dawned with devastating news. Patricia Chen called at 7:30 with barely controlled panic in her voice. "Evangeline, there's been a serious problem with client accounts. Nearly $40,000 is missing, and your name is all over the financial discrepancies." The investigation that followed was a nightmare of accusations and mounting evidence. Detective Morrison showed me printouts of wire transfers initiated from my computer using my login credentials, transferred to accounts I'd never seen. The fraud had been sophisticated, gradual, and left a digital trail that pointed directly to me. "We need to understand how someone could have accessed your login credentials," Detective Morrison said. I admitted that someone had been accessing my personal accounts, but explaining that my sister was the likely perpetrator sounded paranoid even to me. By noon, I was suspended from Meridian Digital pending criminal investigation. My career was destroyed, our wedding savings were gone, and I faced potential prison time. When I called Jonathan to explain, the conversation that followed ended our engagement. The Evangeline I fell in love with would never have let someone gain that level of access to her accounts, he said. Something doesn't add up. His inability to support me through the crisis revealed that he needed a partner who would never require him to choose between love and security. I returned my engagement ring and watched the last pillar of my life collapse. That evening, I arrived at Hartford's estate for Seraphina's anniversary party with nothing left to lose. She greeted me in a stunning emerald dress, playing the perfect hostess while knowing she'd orchestrated the complete destruction of my life. "I know tomorrow is your big day," she said with mock sisterly enthusiasm, "but family celebrations are important too." Within minutes, Caspian appeared at my side. "Aunt Evangeline, can I show you something upstairs? Mom said I could give you a tour of the house." In Hartford's study, Caspian revealed the truth that would destroy his mother. He showed me the sophisticated computer setup she'd been using for her family business, the notebook where he'd carefully recorded financial transactions and account numbers, and most devastatingly, his understanding that something was wrong with their secret games. "She has me write down numbers and remember passwords," he explained. "She calls it our secret game and says Hartford doesn't need to know about the boring household accounts." When I called Detective Morrison from the bathroom, her response was immediate. "Stay exactly where you are. I'm contacting Child Protective Services and arranging for backup. Do not confront your sister until we arrive." As I waited for law enforcement, I realized that Seraphina had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd underestimated the intelligence and moral compass of her own son. The child she'd tried to use as a weapon against me had ultimately become the key to her downfall. The formal confrontation came at 11:30 p.m. in the sterile interview room at Millbrook Police Station, where Seraphina sat across from Detective Morrison with her court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking woman named Rebecca Torres, who'd been called in from the county public defender's office. I'd been asked to provide testimony that would be recorded for use in multiple jurisdictions, given the scope of Seraphina's criminal enterprise. Through the one-way glass, I watched my sister's final performance, a masterclass in manipulation that revealed the true extent of her psychological sophistication. My client maintains her innocence regarding all charges, Attorney Torres began, reading from prepared notes. She acknowledges that there may have been some confusion about account access and financial transfers, but any irregularities were the result of miscommunication rather than criminal intent. Detective Morrison placed a folder on the metal table between them, opening it to reveal photographs of Caspian's notebook pages. Miss Blackwell, can you explain why your son has detailed records of financial transactions, account numbers, and what he describes as secret work you had him perform? Seraphina's expression was perfectly calibrated, confusion mixed with maternal protectiveness. Caspian is a very imaginative child who's been through tremendous trauma. Losing his father, adjusting to a new stepfather, changing schools, children sometimes create elaborate fantasies to cope with stress. Are you suggesting that your 10-year-old son fabricated detailed banking information and money laundering protocols as a coping mechanism? Detective Morrison asked. I'm suggesting that a grieving child might have misunderstood some routine household financial management as something more dramatic than it actually was. The audacity was breathtaking. Even facing overwhelming evidence, Seraphina was attempting to gaslight law enforcement while simultaneously undermining her son's credibility and exploiting his psychological vulnerabilities. Attorney Torres shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that her client's explanation was creating more problems than it solved. Detective, without concrete evidence of criminal intent, we have Miss Blackwell's voice on a recorded conversation describing her crimes in detail, Detective Morrison interrupted, placing a small digital recorder on the table. Would you like to hear your client discussing how she won the ultimate prize by stealing her sister's boyfriend, and how she systematically sabotaged her sister's career for revenge? Seraphina's composed mask flickered for just a moment. I don't recall any such conversation. The recording was made during a phone call with your friend Marcus Rivera on March 15th of this year. Your sister discovered it on your abandoned laptop when she was helping you with data recovery. Detective Morrison pressed play, and Seraphina's voice filled the small room with crystal clarity. David is practically eating out of my hand now. I mean, he was Sera's boyfriend, but that just made it more interesting, like winning the ultimate prize. The sound of her own words, spoken with casual cruelty months earlier, seemed to drain the color from Seraphina's face. But even then, her recovery was swift and calculated. That conversation was taken completely out of context, she said. I was venting to a friend about complicated family dynamics, not describing criminal activity. The conversation continues with detailed descriptions of how you sabotaged your sister's professional relationships and accessed her financial accounts, Detective Morrison continued. Attorney Torres held up a hand to prevent her client from responding. Detective, my client would like to invoke her right to remain silent at this time. But Seraphina ignored her lawyer's advice, leaning forward with the intensity I remembered from childhood arguments where she'd been caught in obvious lies but refused to admit fault. Everything I did was to protect my family, she said. Evangeline was always jealous of my success, my relationships, my ability to create beautiful experiences for the people I love. She's been trying to undermine me for years. The statement was so divorced from reality that it created a moment of stunned silence in the interview room. Seraphina had somehow convinced herself that she was the victim of a conspiracy rather than the perpetrator of systematic financial crimes. Miss Blackwell, Detective Morrison said carefully, you've been charged with stealing over $400,000 from multiple victims across several states. How does that constitute protecting your family? I never stole anything, Seraphina replied with genuine-seeming indignation. I managed financial resources efficiently to ensure my son and husband had the security they deserved. If other people were too careless with their digital security to protect their own assets, that's not my responsibility. The twisted logic was quintessentially Seraphina, transforming victim blaming into moral superiority, reframing criminal activity as household management, and positioning herself as the responsible party cleaning up other people's messes. Attorney Torres looked like she wanted to disappear under the table. My client is clearly under tremendous emotional stress. I'd like to request a psychological evaluation before we proceed with further questioning. Your client has been conducting sophisticated financial fraud operations for at least 5 years, Detective Morrison replied. The psychological evaluation will be part of the sentencing process, but right now we need to understand the scope of her criminal network and identify any additional victims. Through the one-way glass, I watched Seraphina's final moments of freedom play out with the fascination of someone observing a psychological case study. Even facing overwhelming evidence and multiple felony charges, she couldn't acknowledge the reality of what she'd done. Her need to be right, to be admired, to be the heroine of her own story was so powerful that it overrode any capacity for honest self-reflection. "I want to see my son," she said suddenly, her voice breaking with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "Caspian needs me. He's been manipulated by people who want to hurt our family." "Caspian is in protective custody pending a full psychological evaluation," Detective Morrison explained. "Given that he was used as an accomplice in your criminal activities, contact with you could constitute further victimization." The word victimization seemed to penetrate Seraphina's defensive barriers in a way that evidence and logic hadn't. For the first time since her arrest, I saw something that looked like genuine recognition of what she'd done to her son. "I never hurt Caspian," she whispered. "Everything I did was to give him a better life." "You used a 10-year-old child to commit felonies," Detective Morrison stated flatly. "You trained him to lie to authority figures, manipulated him into believing criminal activity was normal family business, and created psychological trauma that will require years of therapy to address." The confrontation was finally stripping away all of Seraphina's elaborate justifications and revealing the stark reality of her actions. She'd damaged everyone who tried to love her, including the child she claimed to be protecting. As the formal interview concluded and Seraphina was led back to her holding cell, I realized that justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about truth. For the first time in our lives, Seraphina's version of reality had been systematically dismantled and replaced with objective facts that couldn't be manipulated or reinterpreted. The sister who'd spent decades controlling narratives and managing perceptions was finally facing a story she couldn't change. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses were credible, and the legal system was immune to her particular brand of charm. The confrontation was over, the exposure was complete. All that remained was the long process of rebuilding the lives she'd destroyed and ensuring that justice was served for every victim of her systematic cruelty. 2 years later, I stood in the kitchen of my new apartment in Portland, reading the email that would close the final chapter on Seraphina's criminal enterprise. The federal prosecutor's office was notifying victims that my sister had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, with restitution orders totaling over $600,000 to the 43 confirmed victims of her multi-state fraud operation. The investigation had revealed a scope of criminal activity that staggered even experienced federal agents. Seraphina had been conducting systematic financial fraud for nearly 8 years, targeting vulnerable individuals through romantic relationships, family connections, and social manipulation. Her victims included widowers like Hartford, single mothers struggling with debt, and elderly individuals managing inheritance accounts. The psychological profile developed by court-appointed experts painted a picture of someone with narcissistic personality disorder and sociopathic tendencies who viewed other people as resources to be exploited rather than individuals deserving of respect. The clinical language couldn't capture the personal devastation she'd caused, but it provided a framework for understanding how someone could systematically destroy lives without apparent remorse. My own legal vindication had come within 6 months of her arrest. Detective Morrison's investigation had cleared me of all embezzlement charges and identified me as a victim of identity theft rather than a perpetrator of financial crimes. Meridian Digital Solutions had offered to reinstate me with full back pay and a formal apology, though I chose to relocate to Oregon and start fresh with a new marketing firm that specialized in helping small businesses recover from financial fraud. The irony wasn't lost on me that my experience as a victim of systematic sabotage had given me unique insights into helping other businesses rebuild after similar betrayals. My client list included restaurants whose trusted managers had embezzled funds, retail stores whose bookkeepers had manipulated accounts, and family businesses whose relatives had exploited access to financial systems. Trust but verify had become more than a professional motto. It was a life philosophy that balanced openness to relationships with protective awareness of how trust could be weaponized by people like Seraphina. Jonathan and I had attempted reconciliation during the months following Seraphina's arrest, but the damage to our relationship proved irreparable. His inability to support me during the crisis had revealed fundamental incompatibilities that no amount of counseling could resolve. He needed a partner who would never require him to choose between love and security, while I needed someone who would stand with me through chaos and uncertainty. We'd ended things amicably, with mutual recognition that we'd been right for each other under certain circumstances, but wrong for the kind of challenges that life had actually presented. He'd married a colleague from the veterinary practice 18 months later, someone whose stable, uncomplicated background would never threaten his carefully ordered existence. The most healing outcome had been my relationship with Caspian. Hartford had been granted legal guardianship after extensive evaluation by family services, providing the boy with stability and resources while ensuring his continued access to specialized therapy. Despite everything he'd experienced, Caspian had shown remarkable resilience and moral clarity. I knew what Mom was doing was wrong, he told me during one of our regular video calls, but I didn't know how to stop loving her while also stopping her from hurting people. The psychological complexity of that statement, coming from a now 12-year-old who'd been forced to navigate adult moral territory, demonstrated both the damage Seraphina had caused and the strength of character that had ultimately led to her downfall. Caspian was thriving academically and socially in Millbrook, with Hartford providing the kind of unconditional support that allowed him to heal from his mother's exploitation. My own therapy with Dr. Elena Rodriguez had continued for 18 months, helping me understand the psychological dynamics that had made me vulnerable to Seraphina's manipulation, while developing tools for recognizing and countering such behavior in the future. The work had been painful but necessary, forcing me to confront decades of conditioning that had taught me to accept mistreatment as normal family dynamics. You survived a campaign designed to destroy your sense of reality, Dr. Rodriguez had explained during one of our final sessions. The fact that you were able to gather evidence and fight back shows remarkable intelligence and resilience. But more importantly, you chose to protect Caspian, even when doing so put you at personal risk. That choice defines your character more than anything your sister did to hurt you. The professional vindication had been satisfying, but the personal growth had been transformative. I'd learned to trust my instincts, set boundaries, and recognize that my accommodating nature was a strength when applied to healthy relationships, but a vulnerability when exploited by predators. My new life in Portland included genuine friendships with colleagues who valued my professional expertise, a romantic relationship with David Chen, Patricia's cousin, who approached love with the kind of thoughtful integrity I'd once thought was impossible to find, and a sense of personal agency that I'd never experienced during my years in Seraphina's shadow. The wedding fund that had been stolen and later recovered through restitution had been donated to organizations that helped children victimized by family members' criminal activity. I'd kept none of the money, finding that letting it go completely was necessary for my psychological healing. Instead, David and I had eloped to a small ceremony on the Oregon coast 6 months earlier, with only a handful of friends and Hartford and Caspian as witnesses. The simplicity had been perfect. No elaborate planning that could be sabotaged, no expensive preparations that could be stolen, just two people choosing each other with full awareness of life's capacity for unexpected chaos. Standing in my kitchen with the final prosecutor's email, I reflected on how completely my life had been reconstructed from the wreckage Serena had created. The woman who'd once measured her worth by other people's approval had learned to derive satisfaction from work that mattered, relationships built on mutual respect, and the knowledge that I'd chosen truth over family loyalty when the two became incompatible. Serena would spend the next decade in federal prison, with the possibility of additional state charges depending on ongoing investigations in other jurisdictions. Her criminal enterprise had been dismantled, her victims had received restitution, and most importantly, Caspian was safe from further exploitation. Justice hadn't restored everything I'd lost, but it had created space for me to build something better. The life I was living now, grounded in authentic relationships and meaningful work, was more satisfying than anything I could have imagined during those dark months when everything seemed to be falling apart. Sometimes the greatest gift a predator can give their victims is the motivation to become strong enough that they're never vulnerable to such manipulation again. Serena had tried to destroy me, but in the process, she'd forced me to discover reserves of courage and intelligence I'd never known I possessed. The hunt was over, justice had been served, and the future stretched ahead with possibilities that belonged entirely to me. I deleted the prosecutor's email and started preparing dinner for my husband, grateful for a life rebuilt on foundations that no one could steal, manipulate, or destroy.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.